Good morning, everyone. Good to see you again. We're going to start the day off with our second lecture, Discovery and Revelation, the Consciences of Christians and Humane Bioethics by Dr. Grattan Brown. And then following that, I'll introduce the commentators here listed. So I know you'll enjoy it as much as I will. So if you'd come, we'll invite you to speak.
What are the things that you do hundreds of times a day? You breathe, your heart beats, you chew your food, adjust your body for comfort, you speak a word to others, walk, blink, look, listen, smell, taste, and think. You can stop some of these activities at will. Hold your breath, hold still despite discomfort, remain silent, rest, keep wide-eyed or close your eyes completely. On the other hand, it is impossible to stop some of these activities. You can will to breathe deeply and slow your heartbeat, but never stop it. You can avoid exposing your senses to unpleasant realities, but when something presents itself to them, they sense. And how could you tell yourself to stop thinking except by thinking? Choosing any of these actions presupposes a judgment that it is good to do so. That judgment is conscience, formed by a type of intellectual activity that we perform hundreds of times a day, occasionally about particularly difficult moral questions. The presence of suffering and death provokes not only our senses and our emotions, but also acts of conscience. The person in conscience asks, "What should I do?" in response to the suffering of my neighbor. Healthcare begins as an act of conscience. Cancer, AIDS, muscular dystrophy, and so on set in motion a slow deterioration of the body. Following conscience, we respond with complex regimes of therapy and palliative care. A Christian missionary doctor, for example, in Africa, diagnoses an ectopic pregnancy and in primitive conditions, surgically removes part of a woman's fallopian tube. Tired of the burden of treatment, a 75-year-old man ceases dialysis and accepts death. We make these judgments continually and move on, revising old judgments in the process of forming new ones. Conscience also holds us accountable for our actions. It enables us to act morally and at the same time requires us to do so. It seems to be simultaneously inside and outside us, a paradox. The word conscience itself communicates this paradox. The first part of the word, con, comes from a Latin root meaning together, while the second part, science, means knowledge. Thus, conscience literally means to know along with another. On the one hand, conscience is inward knowledge and moral consciousness, like an inner voice that sounds during wakefulness, urging good actions and avoiding evil ones and trying to work out which is which. On the other hand, conscience is like the witness of another to one's own actions. Despite being an inward knowledge, conscience holds our actions up to moral standards that have their own force and necessity, and that we do not ultimately define, despite the fact that we recognize them while reasoning through the question, "What should I do to help this patient?" Conscience then is a kind of dialogue with another. It's like a kind of dialogue with another who holds us accountable to moral standards, but a dialogue taking place, paradoxically, within oneself. Both secular and Christian traditions have recognized that conscience is a sort of dialogue in which a person witnesses to moral standards not ultimately defined by that individual. The philosopher Timothy Potts has shown that the term conscience is a variation of an ancient Greek term describing the action of a court witness. The verb synoida means I know in common with and bear witness, and applies to a person who knows another person's mind and testifies for or against him in court. As a variation on this meaning, conscience describes an awareness of one's own mind that is nonetheless like the witness of another regarding one's own actions. Thus, conscience holds personal actions up to standards not entirely one's own. If we ask to whose standards conscience holds us accountable, we find at least two responses: God's standards, society's standards, which include civil law, professional standards, and the customs of culture. Here, then, is a secular Christian divide, in which Christians explicitly measure society's standards against God's. Coming from a Christian perspective, St. Paul argues that the Gentiles, who, without divine revelation, might be expected to maintain only society's standards, nevertheless implicitly seek God's. To the Christians at Rome, Paul writes that, quote, when the Gentiles, who have not the law, do by nature what the law requires, they are a law unto themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that what the law requires is written on their hearts, which their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or perhaps excuse them on that day when, according to my gospel, God judges the secrets of men by Christ Jesus. End quote. Paul understands that conscience to be a sort of dialogue within the self in a fashion similar to the Greek understanding of conscience as a witness. This definition of conscience applies equally to Gentiles, Christians, and Jews. Famously, Paul recognizes how his own knowledge of God's revealed law provokes similar conflicting thoughts that accuse or perhaps excuse. He wrote, "We know that the law is spiritual, but I am carnal, sold under sin. I do not understand my own actions, for I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing that I hate." Sometimes we struggle with conscience, wondering if our consciences are mistaken. They may err through lack of information, faulty reasoning, and the influence of a will that does not wish to consider morality. Some people think that the Christian tradition teaches that a mistaken conscience ought to be followed, but that opinion is not quite true. A well-formed conscience ought to be followed, even if it happens to be mistaken. The same cannot be said for one who cares little for morality and cares little to gather the necessary information and reason through to an honest judgment. To turn against a well-formed but mistaken conscience shows a willingness to turn against what one takes to be the truth and God's will, which in any case is a willingness to turn against the truth and God's will. By contrast, following a well-formed but mistaken conscience holds out the possibility of correction because the will to know is there. People discover their own errors by suffering the consequences of them, or perhaps saved by others who teach them. This fundamental doctrine of conscience demonstrates an important weakness of the current conscience legislation in healthcare. Our society is currently in the midst of great debates about legal yet morally controversial medical procedures and methods of research. Many do not want to know about the moral truths of these medical procedures. On the other hand, Christians and others who do want to know object, raising reasons, contradict the desires of those who do not really care. Even among those who do wish to know and get to the bottom of some of these controversies, we have irreconcilable contradictions. However, the hope exists then that they can be eventually corrected over time as consciences are corrected. What is clear is that forcing professionals to act against their conscience regarding such controversial procedures forecloses a legitimate debate and frustrates the correction of consciences. The Christian tradition has recognized that acting in good faith on a mistaken conscience does not bring guilt, but neither does it bring any wisdom about pressing moral questions in one's life and society. Forming a conscience proceeds by gathering relevant information, coming to a judgment, and then acting upon it. Gathering information might show how a pathology is progressing, how medical interventions might influence that progression, what informed consent requires and the patient's good demands, how the benefits and burdens are perceived by the patient and the family, how a payment might be made, and which moral and legal principles are relevant. Forming a conscience continues by evaluating reasons for each option, yielding a cluster of more or less coherent reasons for and against each option. Among professionals, these reasons can be known and discussed in institutional and public contexts. They can be shared wholly or partially by groups. In a polity guided by reasoned arguments, this social aspect of individual conscience may eventually become the foundation of any truly moral consensus, in which groups argue for and against particular laws. The dialogue of consciences may serve to identify a tolerable range of legitimate actions and to recognize certain actions as inherently immoral. Over time, a well-formed conscience also demonstrates what types of actions adequately express charity and what charity means in particular circumstances. There exists in the Christian tradition a paradigm for growth in charity, although it's not very well known today. Growth in charity begins by avoiding sin and mastering the emotions. In other words, in the words of the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm first. Laws, both moral and civil, try to guide conscience in what procedures to avoid. A conscience guided by sound moral principles and just law inevitably challenges the temptation to pursue self-interest at others' expense. It forces a conversion and reconfiguration of one's manner of life, and in the healthcare industry might promote a sort of reform and reconfiguration of medical practices. Growth in charity continues as one undertakes greater projects for the benefit of others. Consider the establishment of a solid medical practice. Such projects develop a conscience capable of cooperating with many people in a morally respectable way, generating a collective reputation for trust in that medical practice that is coveted by any medical institution. As charity becomes more perfect, the person becomes more capable of sustaining interpersonal relationships, including the professional-patient relationship, relationships with colleagues, and outside of professional work. In charity, one judges oneself as if one were another, and in fairness holds one's own actions up to the same standards that applies to others. Not to do so is quite rightly called hypocritical. Yet this fairness dynamic within conscience cuts in another direction as well. One holds the actions of others up to the same standards that one applies to one's own. And this dynamic within conscience illustrates not only a self-critical aspect, what I ought or ought not to do, but also its social argument and a foundation for human love, what we ought and ought not to do. Conscience presumes a type of self-criticism that one could and should share with others for mutual benefit. To take a controversial example, a pharmacist's refusal to fill a prescription for a contraceptive and abortifacient constitutes an act of self-criticism about the meaning of his action if he were to fill it. In justice, that pharmacist should consider not merely the inconvenience to those in disagreement, but more importantly, the moral consequences to everyone who provides and uses those drugs. Well-formed consciences, then, contribute to the common good of a society. The common good is the good of each person and of all the people in the society together. The common good cannot be divided up and distributed among the members of the society. For example, a fictional Mercy Hospital is good for each member of the institution and all of them together. The hospital might be sold and the proceeds distributed, but the materials are not its common good. Its mission, common activities, and organization of individuals are its common good, all of which depend upon the union of the members that the institution brings into existence. In an analysis of the common good in Catholic social encyclicals, Russell Hittinger shows that the common good includes three interrelated sets of goods. First, goods realized within individuals themselves that yet are a benefit for others, such as health and education. The improved health of a patient is a good not only for the patient, but also for caregivers and society. If you have any question about that, the improved health of a patient, ask the caregivers. It's good for them as well. In addition, this type of common good includes the experienced, well-formed conscience of a medical professional who is consistently able to imagine ethical and personal plans of patient care. Second, the common good can refer to common activities. For example, the activities of providing care cultivate professional skills and a dialogue of consciences among professionals about how to provide care ethically. Thirdly, the common good can refer to forms of communion, such as marriage and the professional-patient relationship. As a form of communion, the common good would include a consensus among well-formed consciences that certain medical practices ultimately undermine human flourishing and therefore ought to be replaced with other practices. When highly controversial practices become legally mandated, conscientious objection becomes a form of public argument by which certain practices are tested and either accepted or rejected. Now let us compare the view of conscience that I've just sketched out with a secularist view, such as articulated by the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, commonly known as ACOG. This secularist view differs from a merely secular view by systematically excluding any religious position. A secular view, by contrast, simply argues without appeal to religious principles, because either one is not religious or simply desires such an argument. Secular arguments are valuable insofar as they demonstrate some truths, though limited in that they do not relate those truths to divine revelation. By contrast, secularist arguments show an antipathy toward religion. In an authoritative position paper entitled "The Limits of Conscientious Refusal in Reproductive Medicine," ACOG defines conscience as, quote, the private, constant, ethically attuned part of the human character, end quote. Now, if private means possessing inner knowledge, then conscience is surely private. If part of the human character means contributing to personal integrity, moral integrity, then conscience certainly does. But if private means not public and not common, then following conscience appears as the pursuit of one's self-interest and no benefit to others. This definition makes even the preservation of one's moral integrity appear as self-interest. By contrast, moral integrity indeed sometimes involves subordinating one's self-interest to that of others, but the ACOG definition overlooks this sense. Moreover, conscience is not really private because it forms a judgment based on standards not entirely its own. People differ on the source of those standards, but they are certainly not private. A better word is personal, which captures the reality of an inner knowledge formed by moral principle as well as personal values, and thus not reducible to self-interest. This secularist definition presents conscience as a feeling about oneself, rather than as knowledge about what is morally good. Quote, an appeal to conscience would express a sentiment, such as, if I were to do X, I couldn't live with myself. I would hate myself. I wouldn't be able to sleep at night. Conscience does show how one's actions influence oneself. Conscience does hold a person accountable for one's own actions. But to claim that conscience expresses mere sentiment strongly suggests that its judgments have no rational basis. Moreover, to claim that conscience provokes only guilty feelings and self-hate strongly suggests that its judgments have value only for oneself and not for one's patients. In this view, to be bothered by one's conscience in the face of the suffering of one's patients appears as selfishness rather than an expression of moral concern for one's patient. By presenting a professional's conscience as an expression of self-interest, the ACOG position easily marginalizes any judgments of conscience that conflict with its own standards, which, in its view, represent true social values on the issues that vex public debate. ACOG argues that, quote, in some circumstances, respect for conscience must be weighed against respect for particular social values, end quote. This statement contains a grain of truth. Individual consciences can be mistaken and undermine the common good. But this statement also contains a fatal contradiction. If respect for conscience must be balanced against social values, what balances the professional's conscience against those social values, except conscience? And this contradiction forces the question, whose conscience makes this judgment, and according to what principles and whose social values? The ACOG committee opinion effectively excludes any claims of conscience that oppose abortion. The paper correctly notes that, quote, claims of conscience are not always genuine, and that conscience claims may mask distaste for certain procedures, discriminatory attitudes, and other self-interested motives, end quote. Yet the statement's criteria for judging true and false claims of conscience unfairly target abortion opponents. Quote, providers who decide not to perform abortions, primarily because they find the procedure unpleasant or because they fear criticism from those in society who advocate against it, do not have a genuine claim of conscience, end quote. Notice how this statement, after having defined conscience as a sentiment, proceeds to exclude the sentiments a person is likely to feel about abortion, distaste for the procedure itself, and the fear of witness of others to one's conscience. But perhaps medical professionals find abortion distasteful because there is something wrong with it. Perhaps people fear criticism from abortion opponents because they have come to recognize true moral standards that prohibit it. ACOG seems to be arguing that opposition to abortion is illegitimate because it is opposition to abortion. In the current political climate, opponents of conscience protection sometimes accuse objectors of seeking a privileged exemption from the law, as if conscientious objectors wanted, out of self-seeking, to be excused of a burden licitly imposed upon all. The current healthcare reform in the United States lacks significant conscience protections regarding legal and yet morally controversial medical procedures, especially abortion and euthanasia. Government mandates to perform such procedures would then force conscientious objectors into the position of civil disobedience, and, from a Christian perspective, of martyrdom. A type of martyrdom. Forcing conscientious objectors into this position will compromise the quality of future health care by further obscuring the moral debate that continues in our society regarding these procedures and by frustrating the development of alternatives to them. conscience protection laws are necessary but not sufficient to promote a climate of healthy debate regarding legal yet morally controversial procedures. However, the current conscience protection law covers few procedures. And moreover, just last month, the Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, rescinded a rule that implemented several decades of conscience protection legislation. The HHS itself had established this rule in the final days of the Bush administration, surely anticipating that the incoming Obama administration would fail to implement that legislation. The Bush administration's version of the rule, called the 2008 Final Rule, described the unjust discrimination it foresaw entering the healthcare field. Quote, "The department is concerned about the development of an environment that is intolerant of individual objections to abortion or other individual religious beliefs or moral convictions, promoted by the mistaken belief that rights of conscience and self-determination extend to all persons except healthcare providers." End quote. This discrimination will likely lead, as the final rule explains, to the loss of religious organizations of healthcare with, quote, "traditions of issuing clear public guidance which informs the members of their workforces of the parameters under which they should operate to follow the organization's overall mission and ethics," end quote. Although Catholic healthcare is not explicitly mentioned, the Catholic Church is widely known for its tradition of issuing clear public guidance on healthcare in the form of the Ethical and Religious Directives for Catholic Healthcare Services, commonly known as the ERD. This document explains the moral foundation of Catholic healthcare in the natural law and the grace of God. Its directives provide precise definitions of legal yet controversial procedures: direct abortion, a contraceptive act, a reproductive act, euthanasia. The directives then reject these acts through brief but reasoned arguments that those procedures undermine professional integrity, the professional-patient relationship, and by extension, social peace. The positions in this document were developed through wide interdisciplinary consultation and debates among Catholics themselves. In some cases, the debate continues about how to properly interpret and implement the directives. By organizing healthcare institutions according to these directives, the Catholic Church attempts to demonstrate their truth and develop alternative procedures. Surely this engagement with the most morally controversial procedures in medicine merits the conscience protection necessary to advance the debate. Finally, the Bush Final Rule respected the fact of moral disagreement and fostered open communication. It recognized that, quote, "the doctor-patient relationship requires a balancing of interests, by which it means the balancing of patients' interests in obtaining legal healthcare services and, on the other side, the statutory right and interest of the provider not to be discriminated against based on a refusal to participate in a service to which they have objections, such as abortion," end quote. With these words, the rule acknowledges the underlying moral debates about a variety of services, including abortion. The rule does not try to foreclose debate by eliminating either side, nor does it consider conscientious objection to be the pursuit of self-interest. Instead, it promotes open communication, which recognizes not only the limitations of civil law, but also the fact that important moral debates will be answered by the free and open exchange of judgments of conscience. In fact, the Bush Rule uses the phrase open communication 9 times, as well as phrases such as full and honest conversations and foster open discussion to explain the type of conversations that ought to occur between professionals and patients and to explain the rationale for conscience protection. The arguments against providing conscience protection presume a narrow view of what the common good requires. Some commentators argue that allowing conscience protection, and thus the refusal to cooperate in abortion, would restrict access to the procedure, causing undue burden to women. First, the commentators who made this argument typically provided no data showing that reduced access would be the likely result. In fact, there probably is no data to ever prove that one doctor's refusal renders access impossible through another doctor. It is more likely that conscience protection will increase access because people may enter medical practice with less fear that their conscience will be violated, if not about abortion, then about some other issue. Second, denying conscience rights will itself cause many burdens for society. For example, the burdens on professionals forced to cooperate in abortion and other types of procedures, to abandon one's profession, to seek another one in mid-career. Society will lose senior professionals whose experience reflects a decades-long formation of professional conscience and growth in social charity. In addition, medical schools will be encouraged to screen applicants according to their views about an ever-growing list of controversial procedures. Hospitals will either have to perform those procedures or cease operations, perhaps sell the hospital, disrupting access to the many uncontroversial means of care and cure. Patients will not be able to find medical professionals who share their moral convictions and benefit from their experience in providing care according to those convictions. To illustrate this danger, consider the pregnant wife, pressured to abort her child because her obstetrician does not accept or, practically speaking, even know another way of managing her risky pregnancy. Surely the common good requires a consideration of these burdens as well as an open discussion of the morality of abortion and the justice of laws regulating it. Arguments against conscience protection lead to the conclusion that any medical professional with objections to abortion should leave medical practice. This view singles out opponents of abortion and overlooks the fact that healthcare professionals regularly note ethical problems and argue convincingly for change, and thereby contribute to the common good. Moreover, this view supposes that medical professionals could resolve their consciences simply by ignoring the practice. At best, this view overlooks the fact that conscientious objection is itself a moral argument in a society-wide debate. At worst, this point of view refuses to engage with any perspective and seeks to legislate away differences of opinion and of conscience. Now, social pluralism sometimes makes life rich and joyful. We can think of the many cultural differences in all, say, the different restaurants that we could go to, maybe in the area of downtown Houston. Social pluralism makes this life in this world interesting and rich. Yet, it also can bring conflict, and for some, a conclusion that moral truth does not exist. The philosopher David Archer notes succinctly the central problem: whether the fact of difference, plurality, licenses a view, pluralism, that it is legitimate, rather than just inevitable, that such differences should persist. The plurality of views on the most morally controversial medical procedures raises precisely this question. Some hold that no true common principles exist and point to the very fact of moral pluralism to prove it. The political philosopher Hadley Arcus outlines clearly the logic of this position with which he disagrees. Quote, "If there were moral truths that held universally, they would be acknowledged in all places. The fact that they are not, that we find instead a widespread disagreement over the things that are right and wrong, stands as prima facie evidence that those universal moral truths do not exist." End quote. This position is mistaken because such moral truths might not be recognized, even though they exist. On the other hand, such truths might be acknowledged in all places if they were recognized. If not recognized, those moral truths, called the natural law, might still exist and operate. Here then is the logic of the natural law. By following the moral principles that resonate with human nature, persons discover how moral actions are not only justifiable, but also promote individual perfection and social peace. This approach promises not only to articulate true principles for evaluating action, but also to draw forth wisdom about human behavior and a limited understanding of human nature itself. If judgments of conscience in healthcare could reflect truths of human nature and shape calculations of burdens and benefits according to a sound interpretation of moral principles, those judgments might lead society to reject practices that undermine human nature and to adopt alternatives that promote human flourishing. Now, a moment's reflection upon this description of the natural law suggests grave difficulties, limitations. First of all, the natural law is difficult to understand and use. Our consciences most readily focus upon the foreseeable consequences of actions and the most commonly invoked principles, autonomy and justice. Conscience also does not easily relate the rationale for acting to the natural dispositions to survive, to form communities, to seek and tell whatever truths one can. And this difficulty raises a second, namely, when opponents in debate both claim natural law justifications for their contradictory positions. For example, slavery was both justified and rejected by natural law arguments. Both sides cannot be correct, and the principles for distinguishing the true from the false lie in the natural law itself and in human nature. And this difficulty points to a third, the plural views of human nature itself. In a well-researched anthology entitled Defining the Beginning and End of Life, John Lizza presents a bewildering number of theories of persons as immaterial souls, ensouled bodies, human organisms, psychological functions, psychological substances, constituted by bodies, relational beings, and self-conscious beings. If you don't suffer a loss of identity just from that list, I don't know what you can do. Finally, the value of natural law in social discourse remains limited by overweening self-interest and the refusal to take an interest in morality, never mind natural law principles. This fact indicates the most fundamental limitation of the natural law, sinfulness. Sinfulness explains the double limitation of skewed understanding and self-interest, traditionally called the darkening of the intellect and the weakness of the will. Christians recognize grace as the fully satisfying solution to the problem of sinfulness, with human conscience and action somehow incorporated into the action of God by grace and a conversion toward charity. To discuss grace in the context of a conscience debate will surely bring the objection that grace is irrelevant to those who are not religious. But the primary purpose of grace is not to make someone religious, but to make someone holy, which includes overcoming sinfulness. Believers and unbelievers alike will recognize that all are sinners. Moreover, Catholic theology recognizes that all, in some way, are offered grace and may cooperate with grace. In 1964, the Second Vatican Council expressed centuries-old teaching with the words, quote, "Those who through no fault of their own do not know the gospel of Christ or his church, but who nevertheless seek God with a sincere heart, and, moved by grace, try in their actions to do his will as they know it through the dictates of their conscience. These too may achieve eternal salvation." End quote. According to this teaching, each person receives the offer of God's grace. Drawing the person toward God, this initial grace is a supernatural gift, not merited by that person's action and sufficient for that person's salvation. Some respond to this offer by trying in their consciences, in their actions, to do his will as they know it through the dictates of their conscience. Grace illuminates their intellects to reflect upon the natural law and its relevance to their actions. It inspires their hearts to follow a conscience informed by this law and develops a corresponding growth in charity. Cooperating with grace and following a conscience formed by natural law will eventually lead an unbeliever to the love of God and of neighbor as self in God. That cooperation with grace need not begin with Christian baptism. It might begin with an engagement in conscience with moral principles grounded in nature and grace, publicly proclaimed by inspection by anyone, such as the ERD in the Catholic Church. This growth in charity might occur over years as members of society work out difficult moral issues through civil argument. Perhaps Paul had this grace in mind when writing about the Gentiles, who have the law written on their hearts and a virtuous life, but no knowledge of divine revelation to complete their understanding of morality. This appeal to grace and natural law will not resolve all conflicts of conscience. It may, however, explain how consensus regarding some fundamental issues is possible. Is there a way to grasp some principles of the natural law sufficiently to establish certain actions as inherently evil? Consider, for example, the question of abortion, including embryonic stem cell research. The issue ultimately hinges on the moral status of the embryo, which, if it is a person from conception, ought not at any time to be deliberately destroyed by a direct abortion for research. This judgment of conscience about the embryo depends upon two truths: that the embryo is also a person, and that persons ought not to be deliberately killed based upon their stage of bodily development. A skeptic might object first that there is no truth, because all determinations are from one or another perspective. The obvious response to this objection asks if that proposition is true. If it is true, as the skeptic clearly believes it is, then the proposition there is no truth is self-refuting and in a way self-correcting. Arcus proposes that self-refuting arguments lead inevitably to necessary truths. These necessary truths ground moral principles consonant with human nature. As an example, he recalls Abraham Lincoln's arguments against slavery based on the principle that individual characteristics do not determine personhood. The attempt to determine personhood by specific personal characteristics backfires because the underlying principle of human equality turns those characteristics back upon the one offering the argument. Listen to the words of Abraham Lincoln. You say A is white and B is black. It is color then, the lighter having the right to enslave the darker. Take care. By this rule, you are to be the slave of the first man you meet with a fairer skin than your own. Do you mean not color exactly? You mean that whites are intellectually the superiors of the blacks, and therefore have the right to enslave them. Take care again. By this rule, you are to be the slave of the first man you meet with an intellect superior to your own. But say you, it is a question of interest, and if you can make it your interest, you can have the right to enslave another. Very well. If he can make it his interest, he has the right to enslave you. Similar arguments that the moral status of the embryo depends upon a combination of specific characteristics fail because they make personhood depend upon a quality of the person. For example, to justify embryonic stem cell research, the Jensen Corporation argued that the moral status of a human depends upon physical characteristics and stages of development, including genetic uniqueness, potentiality for development, sentience, brain activity, degree of cognitive development, capacity for survival outside the mother's womb, and degree of relational presence. But attempts to found personhood on physical characteristics are self-refuting because they make a general principle, personhood, depend upon parts of a person and stages of development. Such arguments imply that if a human person does not develop or loses a certain part, then that human is never or no longer a person. The contradiction in this argument leads to the question, in what do these characteristics subsist? From a biological perspective, they subsist in an organism. Thus, the relevant question is not what characteristics this particular thing has developed, but whether the thing with these characteristics is an organism, at whatever stage of development. Biologically speaking, a particular organism is human or it is not. From a philosophical perspective, an organism is a whole with parts. If one focuses on characteristics at any stage of development, one focuses upon a part and not the whole. Although science and philosophy observe individual characteristics to distinguish types of things from each other, the characteristics themselves do not constitute the things. The attempt to make them define the whole of the thing leads inevitably to a contradiction that refutes the argument itself and leads in another direction. This reasoning leads toward a judgment that the embryo falls into the category of human persons and thus should not be intentionally destroyed. By this example, I've tried to demonstrate how following out the contradictions and false arguments may lead us to necessary truths in the natural law and to a foundation for accepting or rejecting certain legal but morally controversial practices in medicine. The Christian tradition grounds bioethics in nature and grace and proposes a humane bioethics. The Oxford English Dictionary finds 3 senses of the word humane, 2 of which characterize a bioethics worthy of human society. Originally, the word humane meant civil, courteous, obliging towards others, and later characterized by sympathy and with consideration for others, feeling or showing compassion. In this sense, the word humane describes the imitation of Christ, confronted by those who failed to understand the gospel, and worse, by those who positively refused it. And yet Christ unapologetically continued to witness that gospel by word and deed, knowing that every person is offered the gift of grace, and willing to accept persecution rather than do or cooperate with evil. The word humane also carries the sense of humane letters. That is, quote, designating those texts or branches of study which concern humanity, or which have been regarded as exercising a civilizing influence on the student or reader, end quote. This sense points to the difficult integration of knowledge required to grasp truths relevant to bioethics, in an integration impossible without grace. Finally, there is a sense of the word humane that describes certain immoral compromises in secular bioethics. The word humane may also mean, quote, designated or calculated to inflict minimal pain, as in a humane killer, end quote. This sense recognizes that bioethics, in an effort to minimize suffering, may end up using death and other forms of violence as a means. Christian bioethics, on the other hand, tries to overcome this final sense of humane through the cooperation of nature and grace, aiming, where possible, at dialogues of conscience characterized by sympathy and rigor.
I'd like to ask our commentators to come up now. We have first up Dr. Jeff Bishop, then Dr. Jeff Green, and then Dr. John Hittinger. If you would make your way to the stage, and we'll do about 15 minutes apiece. Thank you.
All right. I'm going to do three moves in what I've got here to present. First is just kind of summarizing Professor Brown's points. Second, I'll kind of focus on some of the aspects of the social dimension of knowledge that he points to as well. And thirdly, I'll begin to actually poke at his argument a little bit. Thomas Aquinas defines conscience as nothing, quote, nothing else than the application of knowledge to some action. The Catechism of the Catholic Church defines conscience as, quote, a judgment of reason which at the appropriate moment enjoins a person to do good and to avoid evil. Professor Brown presents us with an equally traditional account of conscience, as articulated through the natural law. First, he carefully unpacks the definition of conscience and concludes that the appropriate definition is nothing more than an act of judgment, judging that some action or other is good or bad. He makes conscience ordinary and mundane, and that it is always engaged at all times. At points, however, he notes conscience, this act of judging, occasionally requires us to make difficult decisions about difficult moral questions. Another feature of conscience is that it also allows us to hold ourselves to some standard. So while conscience is an act of judgment of my own action, it is at the same time as if I am being judged by some other third party. While many of us think conscience is an appeal to some other objective standard, it is still an act of an individual judging him or herself by appealing to some standard outside him or herself. Thus, the self in some manner observes the standard outside itself and applies it to itself. And being sincere and honest with oneself is required for judging oneself. Yet conscience is both shaped and shapes the social environs, the community within which it is formed. After all, quoting Professor Brown, conscience presumes a type of self-criticism that one could and should share with others for mutual benefit, unquote. While Brown's etymology for conscience, knowing together, is partially correct, conscience, to know with another, conscire alii, became even in medieval philosophy to know oneself, conscire sibi, to know within oneself. This meaning seems to be how the term was mostly used in medieval philosophy, then into the Protestant Reformation as well, but also into our contemporary age. This is not a major point against Brown, but just a note that in its common usage, we do not think of conscience as something shared with others so much as it is a special kind of insight. Shared with, I lost my place here, that one has in keeping one's own counsel. Brown is attempting a corrective of sorts, such that one can once again begin to engage with the social dimension of knowledge. Brown highlights this problem by next describing the way in which the secularist understanding of conscience focuses on the private and interior judging of one's actions and whether or not it is good to act in some way. It is this private, interior aspect which one keeps one's own counsel that the secularist targets his attack on conscience clauses. It is at this private aspect of judgment, say, for example, the judgment that abortion is wrong, that violates the public policies that support abortion rights. Brown rightly shows the inconsistencies of the secularist position as articulated by the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology statement on conscience. And it is here that I wish to formulate a few criticisms. We no longer live in a culture in which the shared values are such that we can agree on what a well-formed conscience is or what an ill-formed conscience is. In other words, I fear that attempts to appeal to fine philosophical distinctions in order to prove an argument is no longer possible here amongst the ruins of Christendom. Yet Brown persists in attempting to do so by appeal to the natural law. Let me take a few examples to illustrate my points. Brown states, the supposed conflict between religion and science is often a conflict between irreconcilable philosophies of science. Moreover, sometimes the scientist is also religious and the believer also a scientist. Religious and secular worldviews are equal in that they adopt philosophical principles in moral debate. Thus, it seems only fair that the adherents of each have the opportunity to show the value of their doctrines for the good of society. I'm not quite sure what to make of this statement. It seems that society is to decide whether religious philosophies of science are more valuable than secular philosophies of science. Certainly, science can grow and thrive within cultures that are religious, and certainly religious belief will shape the questions and even the methods one might apply to those empirical questions. In other words, scientific questions emerge as scientific questions out of a social and cultural milieu for the kinds of knowledge one ought to find desirable. So let me give you an example, though, of one that's born out of a completely secularist, the kinds of scientific questions that emerge out of a completely secularist philosophy. For example, in the early 1980s, in an increasingly secularized Britain, there was a push by British scientists to develop screening tests for spina bifida so that it could be caught early enough in pregnancy in order to prevent it. Of course, preventing spina bifida at the time meant preventing the birth of those with spina bifida. That spina bifida was problematic for the National Health Service in terms of cost was a major driving force behind the rise of the alpha-fetoprotein test, which we now deploy consistently across the West. They wanted a cheap and easy test so that, given a certain level of alpha-fetoprotein, they could recommend to the mother that she abort her fetus. In a religious culture, one can imagine that no one would ever even have sought such a screening test designed to assist in termination of pregnancies. In other words, there is no neutral society or culture that can sit in judgment about objective scientific questions because the society seeking its own goods sets those questions up. Thus, it seems that Brown is telling us that we need to, let me use a metaphor here, to parse our Latin a little better, while the vast majority of people in the culture are speaking English. Or more accurately, Brown is attempting to describe why the moral language of a now-dead Christendom is at all appropriate for the moral languages of modernity bent on efficiency and effectiveness. Brown cannot help but sound confused speaking Latin to modern English speakers. I fear that I like Latin. Okay, don't get me wrong. I like what he does. I mean, I agree with it because I share something else more fundamental, I think, than the natural law with Brown. So Brown cannot help but sound confused speaking Latin to modern English speakers. I fear that he is attempting to argue for a now-dead language of Christendom by trying to convince everyone that the religious language is more efficient and effective. In other words, he is trying to tell society, if you will but listen a little more carefully to the language of Christendom, you will see that, in fact, it is itself more efficient and effective than the moral languages of modernity, whose highest values are efficiency and effectiveness. In other words, the standard by which we are judging religion is the standard of modernity and reason. Yet this assessment is not entirely fair to Brown, for Brown is no crass social constructionist. Rather, he grounds his system not in the conventions of social value, but in a natural moral language, namely the natural law. Quote, social pluralism makes life in this world interesting and rich, a true statement, yet it also brings conflict and, for some, a conclusion that objective truth does not exist. Notice the importance of this statement. Pluralism leads to some to conclude that objective truth does not exist. Brown, then, is no crass social constructionist. A true, natural, moral language exists. Consider also this quote from Brown. Here, then, is the logic of natural law. By following the moral principles that resonate with human nature, persons discover how moral actions not only are justifiable, but also promote individual perfection and social peace. This approach promises not only to articulate true justifications for evaluating action, but also to draw forth wisdom about human behavior and a limited understanding about human nature itself. Brown claims that moral principles are known by virtue of the fact that they resonate with human nature. In finding these natural laws that resonate with human nature, one discovers how moral action promotes individual perfection and social harmony. Yet he continues that searching for the natural law, one not only finds true justifications for evaluating action, but also brings heightened awareness of the truth of human nature. One must know human nature in order to know when the discovered moral principles resonate with human nature. But in knowing the moral principle, one learns about human nature. Learn the natural language, he seems to be saying, and one will parse the natural moral language correctly. Presumably, for those with the correct natural moral language, i.e. the natural law, one might, 1, conclude that 2, objective truth about 3, the moral fabric of the universe, can be affirmed as existing 4. Or put differently, one might have the right 1, epistemology, to rightly perceive 2, the metaphysical truths about 3, morality, and 4, ontology. Notice the extremely cumbersome nature of this claim. One must first possess the right epistemology when perceiving what is objectively existing, and yet what is objectively existing is precisely the ground of judging that. In other words, the calculus is not only extremely complicated, requiring special skills of practiced philosophical rigor, but is certainly circular because it cannot get outside of the immanent realm of human knowing. Rather than special revelation, Brown depends upon special knowledge in order to know right and wrong. Now, certainly Brown would never claim that one would need to be a moral philosopher in order to know the right thing to do. Surely Brown would agree that there have been holy fools, simple-minded believers who know what to do in order to not violate the laws of God. So is it their naivete, their lack of the foolishness of us philosophers, or is it that they have been practiced and habituated into knowing? Lost my place again. Or is it that they have been practiced and habituated into knowing exactly the right thing to do through prayer and fasting, through the right worship of God? In other words, prayer is a practice forming one in the proper epistemology of openness to God. And in divine liturgy, the noetic experience of the existing one, the triune God, one perceives the right metaphysics of the divine as a divine gift, originating outside of the immanent realm of human knowing and human reason. In other words, one cannot be practiced in epistemology through reason, but through prayer. One cannot perceive the deep and objective truths of the world without having an experience of the existing one. In other words, holy fools do not possess a natural law within themselves, but they have been touched by a divine law and know exactly what the moral thing to do is. I would argue that once there was a Christendom, when once there was a Christendom, the language articulated by the scholars of, say, the 13th century might have held some sort of rhetorical force over those convinced by them. But this moral language was not quite natural in the way that Brown seems to want it to be. The culture of the university out of which this reason unaided by faith, this natural moral language, this natural law was born, could convince rhetorically was, I am messing myself up here. The culture of the university out of which this reason, unaided by faith, this natural moral language, this natural law was born and could convince rhetorically, was really a convention of the university, a convention that in time would itself give rise to the secular. In other words, the ground was not really a natural moral language, a natural law, so much as it was grounded in the shared culture of at least in the 13th century, a millennium-old Christendom, which itself was grounded in praying communities of the monasteries and parishes and not the disputive practices of the universities. For once the theologians crossed the river in Paris, once they left the monastery for the university, the beauty of argument began to seduce them away from the beauty of holiness. And we live in the ruins of a collapsing Christendom. That is to say, the collapsing Christendom is the secular, now bent to clean out all of the rubble that they perceive Christendom to be. Gathering the shards of the 13th century, of 13th century arguments, will not rebuild Christendom, but perhaps praying just might. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm thankful for this opportunity to speak to you with you all and comment on Dr. Brown's exceptional paper. And I'm just happy to see a flourishing academic Christian community in Houston as well. For my comments, I want to briefly touch on two aspects of Brown's paper. First, I want to elaborate on his suggestion that the claim that an embryo is not a person is self-refuting, And this will lead us to the second part of my remarks, where I argue that some lines of argument in the abortion debate lead to what C.S. Lewis has called the abolition of man, and that we should reestablish the role of conscience in medicine as a part of what Lewis calls a new natural philosophy. Now, if I understand him correctly, Dr. Brown holds that the proposition whether or not a fetus is a person depends upon physical characteristics and stages of development is itself self-refuting. And just so I don't have to repeat it, the entire paper, let's just call this proposition Jensen's proposition, in light of the corporation mentioned in Dr. Brown's paper. Now, there are varieties of ways that a proposition can self-refute, some more deserving of the name than others. For example, consider the proposition, this proposition is false. That proposition is self-refuting in a logical, direct sense. It represents itself as false, that is, it self-refutes, and produces all sorts of paradoxes. In a variation of this, some other propositions express what as philosophers call contradictions, or propositions that are necessarily false. The propositions 2 + 2 = 5, or there exist some married bachelors, are contradictions. One might think that they, in some sense, self-refute, as they cannot be true due to their meaning or internal structure. Other propositions self-refute not themselves, but the person who believes them, speaks them, or acts on them. For example, suppose Adam speaks aloud the sentence, "There's no one speaking here or now in this room." In this case, Adam neither expressed a proposition that is necessarily false, for there could indeed have been no one speaking then and there, nor did he express a proposition that directly says of itself, "Hey, I'm false." Rather, he uttered a sentence that cannot be both uttered and be true, though it can be written and true. Other beliefs are such that holding them seems to work against one's own interest. For example, suppose while borrowing money, I promise someone that I will pay them back, even though I don't intend on keeping that promise. We might, along with Kant, say that I have somehow self-contradicted myself. For the maxim, when I believe myself to be in need of money, I will borrow money and promise to pay it back, although I know I can never do so, must necessarily be self-contradictory. So in what sense then is Jensen's proposition self-refuting? I think it's false, and necessarily so. Thus we might claim that it's self-refuting the same way 2 + 2 = 5 is. And while that might be true, I think it misses the heart of what Dr. Brown is trying to tell us. For he argues for the self-refutation of the statement in the context of showing how consensus regarding some fundamental issues, for example, the terminating of human life, is possible. We need to use the self-refutation as a way to see the contradiction then and not the other way around. When I consider Jensen's proposition, it doesn't seem to wear its self-refutation on its sleeve the way some logically impossible statements do. The connections needed to generate the contradiction don't conjure up, for example, the image of a snake eating its own tail. What we want in self-refutation is a sort of logical jujitsu, or judo. We want the supposed truth of the proposition in question to be the main driver or central component of the argument against its own truth. There is no truth, does this in that by believing it, the naive skeptic mentioned by Dr. Brown is almost immediately committed to two contradictory propositions. There is no truth, and there is truth. Dr. Brown writes that science and philosophy observe individual characteristics to distinguish types of things from one another, or each other. The characteristics themselves do not constitute the things. And then he concludes that in attempts to make them define the whole of a thing leads inevitably to a contradiction that refutes the argument itself. I think that's a little strong, given the goal in the last paragraph. In particular, I think the leads inevitably points to a number of metaphysical theses that will have to be front and center in a way that perhaps no single proposition will be the main driver. This suggests that the metaphysical argument is unlikely to be self-refuting in the consensus-building sense above. And so what I want to explore then is whether or not there's an argument that could bring about consensus building in a more obvious self-refuting way. If Jensen's proposition is self-refuting, then we need to look elsewhere for the why. Maybe the Lincoln story can give us a clue to what is self-refuting about Jensen's proposition. What if we imagine the following conversation? It's meant to parallel Dr. Brown's Lincoln example. You say that a fetus is not a person if it does not have a consciousness or the capacity to think complex thoughts. That is fine. But beware that if you do not have consciousness or the capacity to think complex thoughts, then you will not be considered a person. If successful, the above strategy shows us that Jensen's proposition is self-contradictory because it entails that the reader or the person expressing it must irrationally commit himself to the standard that he would not be a person in case he didn't have certain characteristics. But I don't think it's obviously successful. Many who think Jaren's proposition is true would respond by embracing such a standard, thanking their interlocutor for providing a fine application of the view to end-of-life cases. So on deeper reflection, I think we can find some aid, though, in our claim that this proposition is self-contradictory to hold. Consider the following argument given by Harry Gensler, and this is an old argument from the 1980s. If you're consistent and think that abortion is normally permissible, then you'll consent to the idea of your having been aborted in normal circumstances. You do not consent to the idea of your having been aborted in normal circumstances, and thus, if you are consistent, you will not think that abortion is normally permissible. I find this argument compelling. And if you doubt the second premise, the premise that you do not consent to the idea of your having been aborted in normal circumstances, reflect on Gensler's point that we certainly wouldn't consent to having been permanently blinded in the womb under normal circumstances either. And so there's a sense in which this proposition is self-refuting, that is Jaren's proposition. I think believing it puts one in a position to think abortion is normally permissible, and thus, as Gensler's argument above argues, makes one inconsistent. What Gensler's argument adds, I think, to Dr. Brown's argument is a sort of backward-looking perspective and a Kantian-inspired demand for consistency in action. It is not just the metaphysical principles that make Jaren's proposition self-refuting, excuse me, but the added component of virtuous moral imagination that allows us to see the fetus as a person and thus one of us. It brings the irrationality of the belief to the front and center, and thus enables us to see that thinking such and such about a fetus would lead us to irrationality. This type of self-refuting is important because it's what generates the epistemic weight to change minds. And changing minds is hard. And I think it's difficult for any of these arguments to build consensus because Jaren's proposition is the result of a deeper confusion. C.S. Lewis in the 3rd chapter of The Abolition of Man reflects that at the moment then of man's victory over nature, we find the whole human race subjected to some individual men. Done poorly, science and technology and its apparent conquering of nature is just allowing men to conquer other men. Used poorly, reason helps us understand, but it tempts us into reducing everything and saving nothing of our higher selves or values. We must work to push back against the eliminativism prevalent in the common understanding of the world, so that Jaren's proposition is more obviously false. I'm hopeful about this. As Lewis comments, we need not think that analytic understanding must always be a basilisk which kills what it sees and only sees by killing. A greater understanding of teleology, for example, both natural and theological, would, I think, be a start to a more robust metaphysics. It would help counter a contemporary metaphysics which is largely Humean, reductive, naturalistic, and materialistic. And finally, I want to close by encouraging those of you in the medical professions to strongly stand by your conscience in an effort to change the culture of the discipline you are engaged in. The deeply eliminativist scientific culture we find ourselves in has at least some roots in the Baconian claim that it is very proper that we soberly give our faith only to the things that are the faith. To change the context in the way Lewis insists, we must give our faith to all things. In doing so, doctors and nurses can bring about a change in the capacities of our moral imagination. For the greatest evidence one can offer for the possibility of something is the actuality of it, and not compartmentalizing one's beliefs. One can be an actual case of quality healthcare, of a quality healthcare provider who disagrees with the secular status quo. Thank you.
I would like to thank Dr. Brown for his fine paper, and also I would like to thank HBU, Jody Hinsey, Robert Stacy, Father Honeycutt. I've been part of the team that has worked on the conference, and it's just good to have it all coming together and to hear the papers and have the conversation. I'd also like to say that last March, or actually March 2010, we had an event here at HBU with Archbishop Chaput, who spoke about the Kennedy speech of 1960, in which he said he would follow his conscience, and a conscience not formed by any religious pressure. And I think this theme of conscience has been lingering for a long time. And I would also just mention that the Chaput speech I have published in a little pamphlet, and it's available for free back on our table. But I think it is interesting to look back at Kennedy's speech and see that this problem of conscience and how to define it has been really a challenge that I think we've not really met as we should have, and that's been 50 years. I would like to take a few passages from Dr. Brown's talk and suggest, I would like to offer some deepening, possibly a criticism of terminology, but let me see where, if there is a criticism or just a deepening. I'm not sure it's a disagreement at all, but a fuller way of seeing things. And what I like about his paper is that he brings front and center the question of what conscience is. How does one define conscience? How does one understand conscience? And to put so starkly the definition of ACOG, what he calls the secularist definition, and the Christian definition of conscience, where we see the attempt to define conscience with a deliberate exclusion of the religious or transcendent element. And I think one could argue that that's not conscience at all, that whatever ACOG is talking about, it's just the deep equivocation that conscience is something more than a private judgment of distaste. It's interesting, I'm going to get to a passage in a minute, that Cardinal Newman was onto this issue of conscience 150 years ago, in which he saw developing in his fellow professors at Oxford and in English society at large the beginnings of this movement to identify conscience with either a sentiment of what is pleasant or beautiful or expediency, and I think he has made some very nice descriptive arguments about what conscience is, and that it must involve a transcendent light of discernment that helps our discernment. So my question for Dr. Brown is, I didn't like your distinction between the secularist versus the secular use of conscience. And the reason I find that problematic is I think I understand that the term secular is not a bad thing. Secular just means having to do with temporal affairs or a use of reason about practical matters. But it seems to me that secular is just a range of things we judge about and not the source of conscience. I think a better distinction I think you're using is that between faith and reason, that there may be a conscience that is more deeply formed by revelation and a conscience that is more steeped in reason or is not explicitly based upon revelation. Because my argument here, and I want to get to a few passages from Newman and Bonaventure and Pope John Paul II, that even the so-called secular conscience, looking at temporal matters, at some point must lead to what is transcendent. You had mentioned that the very idea of conscience is that we make a judgment according to standards not one's own. And I think as one traces out the sources for those standards, as Newman did, they will either be some kind of social convention, the polite English society that Newman saw among the gentlemen, which he thought was pharisaical and hollow, or the more crass expediency of Bentham and Mill, or it will be some type of religious formed conscience. That's how he tried to set it up. I would like to turn, though, to a quote from Pope John Paul II. And
a general audience, he said the following: moral conscience does not close man within an insurmountable and impenetrable solitude, but opens him to the call, to the voice of God. In this, and not in anything else, lies the entire mystery and dignity of the moral conscience, in being the place, the sacred place where God speaks to man. End of quote. Now, my understanding of John Paul II here is that he's not talking about a Christian conscience as such, but that conscience is that capacity in the human being to eventually encounter God through moral judgment, through moral awareness. He repeated this statement in Veritatis Splendor when he said, conscience is not so much a process of moral reasoning or a moral syllogism or self-reflection, but he said it's primarily, quote, a dialogue of man with God, end of quote. And he uses St. Bonaventure here. Bonaventure said, quote, conscience is like God's herald and messenger. It does not command things on its own authority, but commands them as coming from God's authority, like a herald when he proclaims the edict of a king. This is why conscience has a binding force. End of quote. And I should mention St. Bonaventure was a professor at the University of Paris, so I would just caution people from too easily dismissing professors from the University of Paris. Some were quibblers like Abelard or were undermining the faith, but certainly there was a strong presence of men like Bonaventure and Thomas Aquinas, who were holy men, rational men, philosophical men, and I think they're the models we need to see, that we don't need to split apart faith and reason, the secular and the transcendent, the learned and the common. Obviously, those are in tension, but I think we've seen those men larger than us who have done it, and I think we need to find how we can do that in our day. I think Newman is another one of those great men who said, just another quote from Newman, and I think I'll conclude this point, but he says, conscience does not repose on itself, but vaguely reaches forward to something beyond itself. It dimly discerns a sanction higher than self for its decisions. So we are accustomed to speak of conscience as a voice, or the echo of a voice, like no other dictate in the whole of experience. End of quote. I think Newman's attempt is to say there is a phenomenology of conscience, that this isn't simply an imposition of an ideology or a biblical view, but Newman's argument would be as one reflects upon moral discernment, it's not uncommon to find that metaphor or that idea that I hear a voice or that a voice is speaking to me. He also talked about the analogy of conscience being like, as one judges oneself in light of conscience, that one has pleased your father or disappointed your mother. I know the Freudians will have a field day with that, but I think this is where we have to take the stand. What is the phenomenon of conscience, and can it be reduced to simple social pressures, or is there a personal response? So I like the idea where Dr. Brown says rather than call conscience private, it ought to be called personal, and that personal encounter could be a way to God. You know, Newman dismissed the Thomistic approaches to God, but thought that the way of conscience was in a way a testimony to God's presence, and that if one does not sin against the light, one will be led by that kindly light to faith. So even though faith forms conscience, it was Newman's argument that conscience can be a way to faith. And I think the presence of conscience, although we see how it's been deadened and challenged in a society in which technology and various kinds of calculative reason are the predominant mode of reasoning, I do think there are many indications that the appalling nature of inhumane or immoral treatment of others still rouses up this deeper sense of conscience. You know, just a little note on John Paul II. I met him before he was Pope. I just happened to have been a graduate student at Catholic U when he came in 1976 to give a talk in philosophy. Being an ignorant American, I just thought it was some obscure Polish prelate, and I didn't have anything better to do, so I went and listened, not realizing he has already made his mark at Vatican II, was standing up to the communist authorities. He gave a very impressive talk, and later that day, one of my fellow graduate students said, "That man ought to be Pope." I said, "Are you kidding? He's Polish and he's a philosopher. That will exclude him from being Pope." Well, you know, as we found out, the Holy Spirit had another idea, because I think we needed a philosopher, someone who could argue and understand the contemporary trends of thought and see the harmony of faith and reason. But even more so, I think, the importance of having a Polish man in there. The testimony, you know, his encyclical on Centesimus Annus is a reflection on the events of 1989. And he said, you know, the Polish experience to have been dominated by both the Nazis and communists. Or he said at one time in an address at UNESCO, "I am the son of a nation which has lived the greatest experience of history, which its neighbors have condemned to death several times, but which has survived and remained itself. It has kept its identity, not by relying on the resources of physical power, but solely by relying on its culture." And by culture, he means its religious orientation, its religious commitments, and so on. The point of this is, that I want to say is, I think that the horrors of World War II, even though perhaps they are now receding from our conscience, were fresh in the mind of John Paul II. They were certainly fresh in the mind and heart of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, another great voice from the East that I think has much to tell us, and that their discernment about the crisis of our time is that it's precisely the deadening of conscience, the closing off of conscience to a transcendent. It is interposing the power of the state or the uniform ideology of professional or elite groups, which led to the great crisis of our time. You know, John Paul II wrote a letter at the outbreak of World War II in which he said, "It's our duty before God to remember these tragic events in order to honor the dead. But in addition, we have the duty to learn from the past so that never again will there arise a set of factors capable of triggering a similar conflagration. We should learn the process which brought this conflict to the very depths of inhumanity and suffering." And he said these root factors were contempt for law, contempt for human beings, and for God. That's what opened up the moral abyss. He said it was the abandonment of all reference to God and to all transcendent moral law that placed the world under the ruler of this world, and he said it was palpable that seduction of conscience led to such falsehood in the cult of power and force. I wonder if we are facing a similar type situation. It's not as dramatic as a Nazi takeover or a communist movement, but the scorn for law. Abortion is nothing but a scorn for law. To allow private individuals to kill is just unheard of. It's lawless for someone to be able to demand the killing of another individual. certainly we see in these ideologies, in the press, in Hollywood, in the universities, the scorn for God, the attempt to suppress all reference to God in any religious-based conscience, I think should mobilize us. John Paul II talked about a mobilization of conscience to take a stand, that we will not tolerate or abide the exclusion of our fellow Christians from the medical profession or from the public sphere, because this is not only an exclusion of religion, but I like that reference Jeff made to the abolition of man. It is the abolition of man to show this scorn for conscience. So that's was my first point. I went a little longer than I wanted. I want to make a second point here. But the idea, Dr. Brown, is I think that conscience has by definition, or I think the phenomenon that we're looking at, and I think our explanation of it, always contains within it the reference to a transcendent source and the voice of God, and that we don't want to lose that. I know you don't want to lose that, but I think how we formulate that might be important. You know, a second related point, and this is not as extensive, but my understanding is that one is obliged to follow any sincere conscience, and that's problematic, but I was troubled by you adding well-formed conscience, because I thought there could be almost a contradiction in there, or open you up to the problems that were stated earlier, that how do you define the well-formed conscience, at least on this, as far as acknowledging that someone has a right to follow their conscience. I think, as I read Aquinas anyway, it is you must follow your conscience, period. Now, if it's not well-formed, you're obviously going to get yourself in trouble. It will be within the limits of some kind of common good, or what public authorities will allow will have certain limits. But that as far as personal existence goes, if indeed your conscience, in light of conscience, you have judged that a certain act is right or wrong, you are bound by that. On this very principle, you see, that however vaguely you are responding to what would be the place of the voice of God. And if you are open to the light, I think that's the important thing. There is hope. But I think we need to say that conscience must be respected, and to acknowledge the right of someone to follow their conscience, even if not well-formed. Okay, the last point I would just make is the idea that there is a social mediation of conscience. I think you're heading in that direction and are obviously acknowledging that, but I think we can do more with the work of McIntyre, certainly, but also I'm thinking back in political philosophy to Alexis de Tocqueville, and to see the importance of the intermediate groups. See, I fear that the very isolation of the individual private conscience against the massive industry of healthcare, or the elites who control the med schools, picking off each individual, is already going to lead to a loss of the battle here, and that we should see that it's part of the common good, that there are intermediate associations, and primary among these are, of course, family and church. And this is part of any well-ordered society. It's certainly part of the great American heritage that individuals, although free to choose what intermediate groups they're part of, do find their identity in the intermediate group, that Tocqueville talks about the heart being raised, the mind formed by the intermediate groups, and that he said these are our only way of resisting the onslaught of the majority tyranny. You know, I have a great quote here from Tocqueville, who said, "It's safe to foresee that trust in common opinion will become a sort of religion, with the majority as its prophet, and democracy might extinguish that freedom of the mind which a democratic social condition favors. Thus it might happen that, having broken down all the bonds which classes or men formerly imposed on it, the human spirit might bind itself in tight fetters to the general will of the greatest number." End of quote. So again, I think it's the churches that have the most important role to push back against the tyranny of the majority, even if that means always being in a conflict with, or often being in a conflict with, the media, with the universities, and you name it. And that, I think that's why people like Archbishop Chaput was honored by HBU, as I think they saw in him a courageous man who would speak up, enduring ridicule and criticism of the media or the universities, but that he was stating the truth, and he was willing to encourage those Christians, both of his church, but I think all the Christians in the country, all those of a religious orientation, not to lose faith, not to lose their courage in pursuing the good life as full vested citizens of this country, and that there's no reason to back down or accept the status of second-class citizens. And it's the formation of conscience by the church that I think the church has the greatest influence upon the social order. Thank you.